Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the U.S. Asia Institute and especially Amanda Earls for her coordination for today's program on deep sea mining policy implications for the United States. And, with this assembled panel of deep sea mining policy experts, it's rather ambitious but necessary for us to cover, I think, a wide range of topics. And that's why I prepared some notes here and questions. But all this is going to be done in less than an hour and a half, because I do want to devote at least 15 minutes at the end for you to ask each of the panel experts questions. So let's reserve those questions until the end of the program. Let me introduce our speakers. First of all, Dr. Keating-Bitonti, analyst in natural resource and policy at the Congressional Record Service. Kristin Hengstebeck, Director of Business Development, Market Research in North America for the Metals Company. Dr. Seaver Wang, Co-Director of Climate and Energy at the Breakthrough Institute. And of course, Duncan Wood, Vice President of Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center, but he has a new appointment that he'll share with us perhaps later. Let's be clear that any examination of U.S. policy considerations in deep sea mining is not without controversy, but it's part of a larger narrative that I think we can get to this afternoon about how green technologies can help address global warming. But what we do know is that the current deep sea mining explorations, specifically in the deep sea floor of the Pacific, continues to attract the attention of mining companies, investors, non-government organizations, governments, scientists, and the public, and for good reason, because of the vast amount of valuable minerals, including cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, all located in these international waters, especially in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which spans about, 1.7 million square miles between Hawaii and Mexico. And we understand now, these minerals are critical for various industries, such as electronics, renewable energy, and defense, and demand for these metals is only increasing due to this clean energy transition. Deep sea mining presents the U.S. with a unique opportunity and a responsibility, and that's why we're here to talk about these policy implications to address climate crisis by providing these essential minerals to power us the transition from fossil fuels to green energy. There are an increasing number of American policy observers who believe that the U.S. involvement in deep sea mining for these crucial minerals ensures what? Resource security, technological leadership. It sets the regulatory requirements, including shaping the environmental protection. There are economic benefits, including the processing of the minerals, and of course, the national security issues, because the policymakers know that we must reduce, if not eliminate, the supply chain dependence, namely China's dominance of nearly 85 to 95% of the critical minerals. I think we should just jump into kind of the scene setting context of where we are. And, what is the deep sea? Where is it located? And what is there? And Caitlin, maybe you could place this in some context of U.S. national and international waters. We start this off.
Sure. So I'm going to start with the fact, this introduction to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but just to set the stage for these maritime zones that we're talking about and how that pertains to which agencies are responsible for seabed mining in international waters and domestically. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or as I refer to it shorthand as UNCLOS, it sets a comprehensive framework for the use, protection of the sea, the seabed, the subsoil, and the marine environment. And the U.S. executive branch considers certain provisions of UNCLOS to be customary international law, although the U.S. is not a party to UNCLOS. And so, for example, the United States has established its maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS. And that includes the U.S. Economic Zone, the EEZ, the continental shelf, the extended continental shelf, etc. So UNCLOS establishes that the first 200 nautical miles from a coastal nation's shoreline is under national jurisdiction, and that includes the EEZ, which is the water column, and the continental shelf, which is the seafloor beneath that water column. And UNCLOS gives countries sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing both living and non-living resources in this 200 nautical mile zone. So in general, that's key if we want to talk about it later. In general, the waters in the seabed beyond this 200 nautical mile zone is considered international waters. And with that introduction, I think that distinction between national and international will be important as we go through this conversation today, in particular to which US federal agencies or international organizations are responsible for regulating seabed mining activities in these different areas.
Good. Christian, maybe you can kind of drill down on this international waters and the marine mineral types.
Yeah, so in international waters and the deep sea, there's three main mineral types. Before we kind of dig into that, it might be helpful to level set like what extractive industries do we have in our oceans today? So if you think about it, very specifically for the seafloor, we get about 30% of our oil and gas supply from offshore reserves. There's things like subsea communication cables that carry the wide majority of international internet and phone traffic. And then we obviously have things like seafloor trawling, fishery industry, and you actually have a lot of near shore marine mining. So this would be things like aggregates or sand, tin, salt, sulfur, things that are near shore and often inexpensive to extract. So we do a lot of extraction from our oceans today. And so where we're not currently doing that at commercial levels is in the deep sea. So there's kind of three primary deposit types that are polymetallic nodules. Those are located in abyssal plains, which are between 4 and 6 kilometer depths, and they sit atop the seafloor, so not connected to a substrate. The abyssal plains cover about 50% of the global ocean floor, and so we find nodules in many of the world's oceans, and by and large, the most economic clearing footprint zone that James mentioned at the onset. And there's also cobalt-rich nodules off in the EEZ of the Cook Islands as well. And so if you look at the other two types, there's seafloor massive sulfides. These form at hydrothermal vents and are often, along the what we call mid-ocean ridge, which exists in between the continents at depths between 1 and 4 kilometers. And then lastly, you have ferromanganese crusts or cobalt crusts, obviously containing cobalt. And so those happen where there is volcanic activity around seamounts, a little bit shallower in that they can be 800 meters to about 2.5 kilometer depths. And so by and large, all of those marine mineral types contain iron and copper. And then in the case of nodules and crusts, you have added nickel, cobalt, and manganese content. So just to give a quick overview of what's actually there.
Very good. And since we have a marine scientist here, Seaver, why don't you kind of contrast this with the larger, broader ocean layers and line, of course, in that context.
Sure, yeah. So the nodule fields are primarily located in the open oceans. That's different from the coastal oceans. The coastal oceans are typically, the ecosystem productivity is a little higher than the open ocean. And even in the open ocean, most sort of marine life is heavily concentrated in the surface ocean. So for example, to provide some data points to that effect, animal zooplankton concentrations are typically 100 times higher in the surface ocean than they are at 1 kilometer depth. And then 1,000 times more zooplankton biomass is in the surface ocean than at 5 kilometers depth. So you have sort of at the surface ocean where there's light and where you have sort of phytoplankton growing, and the majority of sort of pelagic fish, et cetera, live high biomass, and then it drops off a cliff as you exit the photic zone, and you're just in the darkness, all the way down to the seafloor. Biomass sort of is very, very low. And then it does tick up again right at the seafloor. The seafloor sort of catches all the dead matter, what we call marine snow or dead fish or whale falls, sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And because there's that substrate for stuff to grow on, and it catches the decomposing sinking matter, that's where you have seafloor life. And then that life in turn, attracts other life that eats it, et cetera. And so you have an uptick in biomass right at the bottom of the seafloor. Now that said, while the seafloor is more biomass rich than sort of the abyssal intermediate sort of deeper waters, it's still a relatively sparse environment in terms of biomass per square meter compared to land-based ecosystems. We're talking low tens of grams of biomass per square meter, as opposed to, say, grasslands or forest terrestrial ecosystems, where the amount of biomass is on the order of thousands or tens of thousands of grams of biomass per square meter. And so this deep ocean is really subsisting primarily on organic matter that's falling from the surface ocean. So, you know, it's sort of a scavenging, recycling-based environment. And there's just this vast sort of physical separation with the surface ocean, which is where the majority of ocean biomass lives.
Thanks, Seaver. Christian, let's discuss how deep sea mining holds the potential to address metal demand and supply chain vulnerabilities. And maybe you'd speak to the forecast market deficits 2028 and 2040.
Yeah, so in terms of, I don't think it's any news to this room, in particular, that critical minerals are key, right, to pretty much all of modern society. And so if we look at really, you know, one, the clean energy transition, so the electrification of right, all the things today that use fossil fuels, but then also kind of a growing global population, really continuing into the mid-2080s for the United Nations. We have just a rising demand for critical minerals and for infrastructure in which those minerals are used. So if you look at particularly the metals contained in nodules, which is what I'll focus on, nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, copper obviously being used in all kind of current collection activity for things like EVs, but also solar and wind power. Looking specifically for copper at deficits as early as next year. And then for cobalt and nickel deficits starting again in 2027 and 28 respectively. And if you look at manganese, which we kind of call like the sleeper metal of battery metals in particular. Yes, there's a lot of it worldwide, but there's not a lot of the refined material. And about 90% of that is refined in China. And so that similarly will be in deficit in 2030. And so if you look at, right, we have to reach these net zero targets by 2050, you're running out of good land-based options based on declining ore grades. And so if you look at the International Energy Agency's forecast for just electrifying transport alone, we'll need about 14 terawatt hours of batteries by 2050. So to level set, that's about 9 times our capacity that we had in 2020. So we'll need all of these different innovations, all of these different supply sources to reach those targets. In the case of nickel in particular, obviously the largest land-based growth market is Indonesia. And even Indonesia has said their high-grade laterite ores will be depleted within that 2030 timeframe. So you're really looking at, you know, what can we do in the next 2 decades to make a dent in those metals that enable us to transition to a clean future.
Good. Duncan, maybe you could address China's present domination of the metals market and the implications for the United States and not the world in supply chain and other issues.
Yeah, it's funny. A few years ago, right in the middle of COVID, when we first began to really talk about the problems of the critical mineral supply chain, we were still at a phase of our understanding here in Washington, which was, oh, so these things were critical minerals, right? Now everybody, you meet on the street kind of knows what critical minerals are more or less. You still come across the odd person who says to you, oh, rare earth elements, that's the same as cobalt, right? But at least they're aware that they exist. I mean, this is that we've made huge progress. But when we first began getting into this 3 or 4 years ago, it came as a very rude shock to everybody that once again, the Chinese had got so far out ahead of us that we found ourselves really asleep at the wheel here in the United States. You look at the Chinese dominance of the critical mineral supply chain. Either, if you're looking at the case of rare earth elements, they're massive producers, or more likely, their companies are active around the world, extracting minerals in other countries, or they are, of course, dominating the processing and refining of critical minerals, pretty much across the spectrum. And this is really a function of where we've come from in our understanding of supply chains and really our approach to global economics, which is that, since the peak of hyperglobalization in the 1990s, we basically came to believe that if you could do it cheaper somewhere else, why not? Why wouldn't you just save money by making your widget in another country? And nobody really questioned it. Nobody really was that worried about the national security implications for this. And so 4 years ago, when we began to see what the demand uptick was that Kristin described, where the minerals were located, who were the companies who were extracting, and most importantly, which country dominated almost every aspect of the critical minerals and indeed the electric vehicle supply chain, then we suddenly realized, oh dear, we're in deep, deep trouble. And I have to say, I give credit to Washington, which is that from that moment of, or that period of great ignorance about this, really willful ignorance that we didn't want to get into these conversations, we've come a long way very fast. We've put in place legislation, we've put in place programs that help to remedy some of the issues in the supply chain. But we're still so far behind the Chinese. And in fact, year after year, the Chinese get further and further ahead, whether it is on the processing and refining side of the critical mineral supply chain, or it's to do with EV technology. And so now, what are our policy options here in Washington? We're now in a situation where we're saying the only way that we can deal with this is actually by imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, on Chinese finished products, on the EVs themselves, on the battery technology. We're desperately trying to slow down the Chinese because we realize we're so far behind. And that, of course, carries over into the seabed mining space as well, which is the Chinese, being full members of the International Seabed Authority, of UNCLOS as well, have been working for years and years to establish their primacy within that organization and to build up their domestic capacity for exploration and extraction of seabed minerals. And so when we have the conversation here in Washington about should we get involved in this, is it the right thing to do? I kind of feel like we're missing the point. The point is it's going to happen anyway. And I have a sense of inevitability about this, and I'll be happy to argue the toss on that one with anybody. But really, we're now in a situation where China, amongst other countries, are in a position where they are able to go ahead and do this. And the United States is still having the conversation about whether or not it's the right thing to do. And I don't think that's morally wrong of us to question whether it's the right thing to do. I think it's absolutely, we should have that conversation, but it's a little bit too late because we made a decision many years ago not to participate in the main decision-making body that is relevant to this, the International Seabed Authority.
Very good. I think we should probably, jump right in and examine the existing and proposed U.S. legislation. And of course, Caitlin is here to kind of provide a brief overview of the current U.S. national legislation related to offshore critical minerals programs, but also includes maybe NOAA's current mapping efforts, and we can jump into that as part of the response from the U.S. government.
Okay, sure. So I'll give a brief overview of existing U.S. statutes related to seabed mining. And so before I even get into this, again, we have to remember that we have two bodies. We have domestic waters and we have international waters. So Congress authorized the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, to regulate seabed mining activities taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction in international waters by U.S. citizens through the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act. Now, Congress authorized the Department of the Interior to regulate seabed mining activities taking place on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf through the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, or OSCLA. So the Department of Interior has delegated offshore mineral leasing authorities to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. So I'll start by providing a brief overview of seabed mining activities occurring on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf, and then I'll transition to U.S. seabed mining activities occurring in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So OSCLA, as amended, authorized and directed the Department of the Interior to establish regulations for prospecting minerals, leasing of those minerals, and associated operations on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. BOEM's Marine Minerals Program manages mineral leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf, and to date, this has been primarily focused on sand and gravel for coastal restoration, such as beach nourishment and habitat restoration. Now, the Marine Minerals Program also manages commercial leasing of gold, manganese, and other hard minerals on the Outer Continental Shelf. But to date, BOEM has not issued a lease for hard minerals on the Outer Continental Shelf. There was a sale lease issued once, but no one bid on it. So that's where BOEM sits when it comes to seabed mining on the Outer Continental Shelf. And now I'll transition to NOAA's activities in international waters. So in 1980, Congress passed the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act, and I'm going to refer to that as DSHMRA because I can't say that over and over and over again. As an interim measure to allow U.S. citizens to proceed with seabed mineral exploration and recovery until an international regime was in place. And what that international regime was UNCLOS, which was still being negotiated in 1980. So Congress authorized NOAA to issue exploration licenses and commercial recovery permits for seabed mining activities taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction for U.S. citizens. And in 1984, NOAA issued exploration licenses for 4 sites located in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And NOAA has not issued any exploration licenses since 1984. And of these 4 licenses issued in 1984, only 2 are active today, and both are held by Lockheed Martin. And then probably stating the obvious, to date, NOAA has not issued any commercial recovery permits under DSHMRA. So that's kind of the state of play for existing U.S. statutes for how U.S. citizens can engage in seabed mining activities on the outer continental shelf and in international waters. Again, understanding that the U.S. is not a party to UNCLOS nor a member of the ISA, but I think we'll dive into that a bit deeper later on. So I'll quickly touch on what type of science activities NOAA and other federal agencies have been doing to explore our outer continental shelf. And so according to a 2022 U.S. Geological Survey, USGS survey, the United States is import dependent for 17 of the 35 marine minerals that are defined as critical. So to address this, the federal government is pursuing a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals. And BOEM is leading the development of the National Offshore Critical Mineral Inventory and is working closely with USGS and NOAA to identify areas on the U.S. outer continental shelf with high economic potential. So once those are identified, these areas can be further evaluated for potential exploring and leasing, while also taking into consideration an environmental risk assessment. And it's estimated that 18 critical minerals of the slew of minerals that USGS has identified, along with DOE, 18 of those critical minerals occur on the U.S. outer continental shelf, including cobalt, lithium, manganese, and rare earth elements. And on top of that, in addition to this strategy, the United States also has a national strategy for mapping, exploring, and characterizing the U.S. EEZ. And one goal of that strategy is to coordinate interagency efforts and resources, pooling resources through NOAA, USGS, and BOEM to map, explore, and characterize the U.S. EEZ. And the second goal of that strategy is for federal agencies to identify, again, priority areas of interest for further exploration and characterization of ocean resources. And so the strategy doesn't really go into much further depth, but one can assume that of the many ocean resources that exist, some of those are pertaining to marine.
Very good. Kristin, might be good to sort of contrast where U.S. is in terms of these strategies with the national policies of, let's say, Norway, Japan, Cook Islands, and we'll contrast that with where we are.
Yeah, so I mean, beyond the US, so there's many countries that really have done a lot of work to both define resources, but also explore potential environmental impacts of sourcing minerals from their own EEZs. So a couple leaders in that space would be Japan and Norway, as you mentioned. So Japan, long history in this space. They obviously have a license in international waters, but their territorial waters are quite rich in almost every type of deposit from marine minerals. So they've done really extensive survey and impact assessments. And as soon as next year, could be commercially collecting nodules and or seafloor clays, which are rich in rare earths in their EEZ. So definitely, I would say, a leader in the space, and obviously has implications from being a U.S. ally. And of course, like, they understand their resource limited on land, right? So they've had a deep history with ensuring that they have supply of these critical minerals that do not just reside in China, their neighbor. For Norway, this is actually a more recent activity. And so earlier this year, their parliament approved by a really wide majority exploration of sulfides and crusts in their EEZ. And similarly, kind of under the radar, Sweden did as well. So in 2023, they issued exploration licenses for nodules in the Baltic Sea. Ironically, the same year that the country joined a call for a moratorium on international deep sea mining, which I find interesting. And then also the Cook Islands have been a leader in this space. So obviously a Pacific Island nation really looking to their own nodules as a way to support a blue economy and trying to transition to clean energy. So they started doing exploration work in 2022. And they have at least one resource definition statement as of last year in their EPC. So lots of kind of national level activity. And then if you look at the international regulatory framework, as Caitlin mentioned, the Law of the Sea becoming a treaty in 82, but then the ISA actually coming into force in 1994. And so as Caitlin mentioned, the activity from the US in that context has not been very active in international waters since. But there have been, a whole slew of different countries that are active. So there are 19 exploration contracts for nodules at the moment, 7 for sulfides and 5 for crusts. And so that has all been under the exploration regime within the ISA, which started in 2001 and was updated in 2013. And we've operated under that for the last, call it 25 years. So the reason why I guess that update piece is important is because they've been able to adapt the exploration code based on additional findings. Something that, they've done in about a decade's time, and we've taken about 150 years to update the mining code in the US. So it illustrates, right, that they're able to actually adapt and change legislation in a relatively short time period for such an international body. And so the metals company has 3 exploration contracts in the CCZ for nodules. They are sponsored by Pacific Island nations, that being Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati. And so we're a Canadian company and listed in the US. So essentially the only North American contractor that's developing the resource in international waters. If we then turn to the International Mining Code, that is still in draft form. It's been under negotiation and development since 2014, so about 10 years. And in 2019, the 4th draft was issued. It was expected that that code would be adopted in 2020. And I think we all know that COVID-19 occurred early 2020 and really delayed that whole process. So we kind of have, right, 168 member countries that used to meet only in person, that then, can't travel and cannot meet. And so they resumed meetings in 21 and now have a roadmap to adopting the code in 2025. And really to do that, right, you need all code components to be complete. And so that's things like the financial regime, which is like the payment, royalties, taxes, also equity and benefit sharing. How do you distribute something that is kind of the common heritage of mankind resource equitably? That's part of the financial regime. You have the environmental regime, which really has a devoted 8 different working groups to determining what are the thresholds, how do we ensure effective protection of the marine environment. And then you have institutional matters, which is the president's texts, which are really like all of the guts of the procedures and processes and policies. And then finally, you have inspection, compliance, and enforcement. And so all of those code components have to be complete in order for the council to consider the code to adopt it. And aside from those environmental thresholds and some of the financial details, really the bulk of the code is complete. And so in February of this year, they issued the consolidated text, which up until then, they had just been negotiating specific pieces. Now that's actually one document moving through the negotiation process. And then also since COVID, we've seen, right, an uptick in the frequency of those meetings. So the ISA meets quarterly, and there's also these intersessional working groups. And so different kind of country members are designated coordinators of those groups, and then they rely on external subject matter experts, which make up the legal and technical commission to actually advise on specific thresholds, policies, areas in which you need like deep ocean expertise, legal kind of expertise on land-based mining, et cetera. And so really it's moving towards its final stages. I know that the Wilson Center did an interview with the Secretary General of the ISA a number of times. And I think That's probably leaning towards why you believe it's a matter of when and not if, is that it's really culminating, 30 years almost of developing that code. And so suffice to say, it would be the most internationally robust and kind of rigorous mining code ever set in place for an extractive industry.
I'm gonna jump ahead of myself. Duncan, maybe this is a good time for you to kind of respond related to the Wilson Center report and the hatch.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the work that we've been doing at the Wilson Center on critical minerals in general has led us quite naturally into the conversation about seabed mining. And our engagements with Michael Lodge, the Secretary General of the ISA, have been, truly, very illuminating for us. And I think for the policy space in Washington, what comes through is that, you've got an international public servant there who's trying to do his job, which is to come up with a code. And, he's a man who is constantly criticized because of the very fervent opposition to seabed mining. But he says, I'm not interested in the question on a professional level of whether this is the right thing to do. I've just been given a job, I'm doing my job. And I think that comes through very, very clearly in that. And before we move on to sort of the technological side of things and the Hatch paper that we produced shortly after that, it's worth also revisiting the scale of the resource on the seabed, because, I think everybody by now knows that what's available in polymetallic nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone dwarfs what's available in terms of onshore resources. A paper that was published a few months ago by Barron's Public Relations actually talked about seabed minerals as the new oil. And if you think about it in those terms, we already know where the next Saudi Arabia is, and it's in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And we're still trying to decide whether or not we should get involved in that particular area. If it was oil, we wouldn't have any question about it. But because it's something new and because it's something which, has got wound up in very much a fervor, a lot of hype, I think that we're not thinking about it rationally. Now, bring it back to the technological side of things, and a paper that we produced in conjunction with Hatch Consulting a couple of months ago, which looks at the processing and refining of polymetallic nodules and how that supply chain could be built out to the advantage of the United States and its allies. And essentially, it's a plea for focusing on the North American space and on certain jurisdictions within the North American space, dividing the processing and refining part of the supply chain into two different phases, pyrometallurgical and hydrometallurgical phases of processing. You see that, in fact, we have potential within North America. If we look at North America as the three countries, that the jurisdictions of Quebec and Ontario in Canada come through as being great options for building out the capacity for processing and refining of polymetallic nodules for two main reasons. For a number of reasons. Quebec is really first in all of North America, and that's because it has very cheap energy. You've got that incredible hydroelectric power there. You've got sea-facing ports, so you could bring in the resource easily. You've got CAM and PCAM facilities already there. You can even say something that we didn't put into our report was about the recycling capacity that they have there already, which they're building out for battery metals. And Quebec is really becoming a leader in the EV sector in North America. Ontario has many of the same facets, as do Texas and Kentucky. And Texas in particular, I have to say, if you're looking at the United States, Texas, and I very much like South Texas, and you look at the Port of Brownsville in particular, Texas has huge potential for building out processing and refining. It's a great jurisdiction in terms of the permitting equation as well. It's much easier to get things done in Texas. And so when you look at what's involved and when you look at where it makes sense, in fact, North America has a lot going for it, but we just have to take that next step of saying, all right, this is a mineral that's going to start coming in to North America. We need it. There's a supply. There are companies and countries out there that are going to be extracting it. Do we want to allow the Chinese to dominate the processing of this as well?
Good. We're going to come back and drill down on the policy implications. And I want to turn to Seaver here to sort of highlight some of the, breakthrough policy recommendations related to U.S. Congress, legislative.
Right.
actions. Yeah.
Yeah, so building on what Duncan just said, the US really needs to sort of signal that it's a sort of an attractive end destination for these minerals to be processed. And so there are a few things that I think the federal government could look to sort of try and foster this emerging sector. So one area is just on the research side. So I think the federal government could play a really important role in really sort of grounding the discourse around seafloor nodules in greater rigor. So whether that's through just synthesizing sort of existing research on sort of environmental impacts, best available technology, what the ecosystem types look like, et cetera. I think people would see I think people could sort of use such research synthesis as sort of a way to really sort of inform these discussions. And then similarly, also supporting new research to further our understanding of how to improve these technologies, what potential impacts could be, so on and so forth. I think it's very clear that the U.S. would need to partner with international countries because the U.S. is not a member of UNCLOS. So whether that's through mineral security partnerships or bilateral trade agreements with countries that are either sponsoring nodule collection activities on the international seabed or conducting those activities themselves in their own exclusive economic zone. And then in addition, one very simple thing the US could do to sort of increase the attractiveness of the US as a destination for these materials would be to actually clarify that if brought to the United States as their first port of call, these nodule materials ought to be considered as domestic content eligible under IRA tax credit rules. That's not something that's currently clarified, but it makes a lot of sense and would be a significant pull factor. And then finally, as Duncan hinted at when talking about Texas, it all just wraps up into the larger discussion of how to make it easier to set up domestic critical mineral processing in the US in general. And so that goes to sort of increasing the efficiency of permitting processes, sort of grants and loans for domestic processing capabilities, incentives for domestic critical mineral processing, and also potentially financial mechanisms as well to balance out price volatility in sort of critical mineral markets that can often kill a lot of promising projects in the opening phases of it, trying to secure financing and so forth.
Very good. Caitlin, I almost think I have to come back to you in terms of looking at the kind of compass points for the 118th Congress and even prior legislation, and how this translates into policy recommendations and what kind of messaging is needed to sort of move that needle forward.
Sure. So before I answer this question, I'll first put on my CRF cap and say CRF didn't provide any policy recommendations, but what we do is we do provide options from across the spectrum for consideration. And so what I'm happy to do is talk about the ways Congress has considered legislation in the 118th Congress when it comes to seabed mining or aspects of seabed mining. And so I came prepared to talk about 5 bills, 2 resolutions that have been introduced or actually passed in the 118th Congress related to seabed mining activities. And so I'll first start by going through the 5 bills, starting with the ones in order of introduction, if that makes more sense to you. And so the House Armed Services Committee reported version of the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2024 through its report language directed the U.S. Department of Defense to produce a report assessing the processing of polymetallic nodules domestically. And what's interesting in the committee's report is that it notes that while the United States holds no ISA contracts, quote, there remains opportunity to evaluate domestic processing and refining of seafloor resources from contracts held by allied UNCLOS parties and domestic partners in international waters, end quote. And I believe other folks on the panel may be better to speak to this than me, but that report is pending, I think, soon. I'll just say pending soon. Up next is HR 3536, and so this takes a different approach, which would direct US representatives to relative international organizations to take actions calling for a moratorium on the permitting of seabed mining exploration and exploitation in international waters and impose investments in support of these activities. So that's kind of just those two things is kind of showing part of the span of options that Congress has taken. Up next is HR 4537, the American Seabed Protection Act. And what this is it would prohibit NOAA from issuing licenses and permits for seabed mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction under DSHMRA, which I talked about earlier, and would also prohibit BOEM from doing the same on the US Outer Continental Shelf under OSPLA. What it also would do is it would direct NOAA and the national academies to conduct a comprehensive study of the environmental impacts on seabed mining. And we'll talk more about that coming up, but what I think this bill is suggesting is that some of the previous work that the federal government has done in the 70s and 80s to look at those environmental impacts, that those could be updated today, given there's been a change in the technologies proposed and demonstrated for mining in the seabed. And I'm going to move down my list. So HR 3736, the Responsible Use of Seafloor Resources Act for 2024, would direct the US government to provide support for polymetallic nodules collection, processing, and refining, and to coordinate an interagency to coordinate the development of the infrastructure to process and refine these nodules within the United States. And again, this is something that my colleagues could probably speak to more eloquently than I, if asked. And then finally, the last bill that was introduced in the 118th Congress is HR 8070, the Servicemen Quality of Life Improvement and National Defense Authorization Act for FY 2025. And this would direct the Secretary of Defense for industrial base policy to enter into an agreement with an entity experienced in refining critical minerals to conduct a study to assess the feasibility of improving domestic capabilities for refining polymetallic nodules for dispense applications. So, like I said, that's kind of a broad gamut of bills that have been introduced, ranging from calling for moratoriums to looking at ways that the US government can engage in the processing and refining of minerals domestically. And then if I have time, I'll just reference two resolutions that were also introduced that are applicable to this conversation. And the first is SRES 4466, and that calls on the Senate to take up UNCLOS, because as we've heard, the United States is not a party to UNCLOS. So it's calling for the Senate to take it up. And the resolution in part contends that as a party to UNCLOS, the United States would be able to participate directly in setting and voting on ISA policies, something that the United States cannot participate in formally now. So a version of this resolution has been introduced every Congress since the 115th Congress. And the last time the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on UNCLOS was in the 112th Congress. And then finally, the last resolution is HRES 1082, and that calls on the ISA to adopt regulations allowing the collection of critical minerals from the international seabed. And in this resolution, it notes that the United States is not a member of the ISA, but could obtain access to seabed minerals located in the CCZ through partnerships with the ISA contractors based in allied countries. And that goes to something that Seaver had introduced. So that's my long-winded introduction.
No,
Some
thank
of the
you.
things that have been considered this Congress.
No, thank you very much, Caitlin, for that. And I didn't know if Kristin or anyone else wanted to weigh in on some other highlights related to resolutions that even Caitlin has brought up to kind of expand upon that, because I think it's important. That's one of the reasons that we're here to look at these direct implications and Congress right now.
No, I think Caitlin gave a really good overview. I think on that HR 7636, it devotes financial and political support to processing and refining, but also tasks interagency groups to look at the relative environmental, social, and governance impacts of specifically nodule collection versus land-based growth markets for those same materials. So there is kind of a studies aspect of that as well. And part of that being, what is the actual economic benefit to the US in terms of downstream industry, but also national security implications should the US actually import that material. Lastly, within that bill is a directive for Department of Commerce to look at kind of the trade implications of this, considering the DSHMRA Act of 1980 and looking at, is there anything between that and the ISA code that they need to remedy in order to import the materials in the future? But really good overview, and obviously, as you can see, lots of legislative activity.
Yes, I think I come back to kind of the mining and the processing and how the scientific research is integrated with this. And of course, Duncan's already alluded to some of this in terms of opportunities for the United States, perhaps in Texas for the processing, but maybe we should kind of examine that a little bit more, and given the current status of nodule collection technology and new technology that is right there on the horizon that will help address some of the environmental impact and issues that we find many of the NGOs are objecting to. So perhaps an interface of science with the processing and how this translates for economic benefit for U.S. companies. Anyone here might address that? Duncan, you had earlier. But,
I might just address like one of the things that Duncan said, and we talk a lot about this kind of rise of US-China competition. And in this space, it's actually quite unique that it's Western countries and companies that are leading on, especially the offshore technology front. So a lot of the ability to have production vessels, remotely operated vehicles, robotics, and deep ocean engineering, a lot of that intellectual property really has its genesis in the US. And so especially along that Gulf Coast of Texas, right, you have all of this kind of oil and gas knowledge and also infrastructure that can be repurposed in this space. And so in terms of actual nodule collection, right, we are using ultra deep water drill ships that we've retrofitted to become nodule production vessels. And so Allseas, which is our offshore partner, they're a Dutch company that's a deep ocean pipeline and construction company that's been doing this for decades. So this type of technology is not new to them, but they actually acquired such a vessel on our behalf in 2020, retrofitted it, and it was doing our pilot collection tests out in the CCZ in 2022. And so, right, the ability to actually have a seafloor collector robot remotely operated, tracking that and all of these different kind of data metrics and sensors throughout the entire 2.5 mile long water column, and then bring up nodules, that hasn't really been done since the 70s. And so when we did that integrated pilot in 2022, that was the first time since then in 50 years it had been done, and lifted the largest volume of nodules ever collected, about 3,000 tons. And so that was, I think even for a pilot and something we're testing, a relatively successful test, and really paramount to the ability of Western companies to do this. So you don't see that the Chinese contractors within the ISA have actually accomplished that. So it's the only integrated pilot to date. And then beyond that, you have the Belgian contractors. They're Global Seabed Resources, subsidiary of Deme Group, and they did their first seafloor robotic collection pilot in 2017, and then again in 21, and then they'll be looking to do that integrated pilot toward 2027 or 28. And so it's really these Western contractors and companies that lead China in that space. So China has announced they have 3 contractors. 2 of them have announced doing the seafloor collection pilot only in 2025. And so you can see that there's maybe a 5 to even 8 year lead on Western countries being able to start potential commercial mining versus Chinese operations. So it's maybe one of the only real ways to kind of decouple and break today's status quo of supply chains on the offshore side. And then on the processing piece, right, there's tons of existing primary smelting infrastructure with which to process nodules. So that's part of what the Wilson Center report covered. And it looked at, where are those smelting operations? They're very similar to nickel laterites, which is like the main resource type of growth coming out of Indonesia, New Caledonia, Philippines. And so there's a ton of that in, for example, China. There's even more in Indonesia, with a small subset not being Chinese owned operated. But there's also facilities in Japan, South Korea, for example. And so we've announced first commercial scale processing with a partner in Japan, Pacific Metals Co., and they're a ferronickel producer, have been since the sixties. And so they're actually doing a pilot trial with 2,000 tons of nodules now throughout the summer, looking at what are the operational changes they need to make to actually process nodules at commercial levels. So that brings you then to refining, right? If we can access the intermediates, we can select where those refineries are. So as Duncan mentioned, Canada is a great place for this. They have existing, right, supportive mining jurisdictions, but also the technical know-how to do the processing work. So we piloted much of that work in Ontario with partners like XPS and SGS, as well as Hatch. And so the flow sheet, taking nodules, converting them to battery grade materials has been completed in Ontario. And so it's very much something that is within the realm of possibility for North American supply chains. Technically, it's possible. We just have to have, right, the regulatory support, but also investment, right? Because there are other countries that would be very happy to take that material, and we like to make sure that it stays in allied supply chains if we can. And so it's really that diversification of supply that we look at, and from, you know, different folks in the audience or in DC here that have history with this, technologically, it's not an issue, right? It's getting the regulatory piece complete and then actually proving out small scale commercial mining before it's expanded.
Yes, I'll just jump in very
Sure,
quickly on that.
absolutely.
Which I think that, Kristen's obviously absolutely right in the sense that the West has this advantage lead over the Chinese in terms of the technology for subsea operations. But let's not forget how much the Chinese are spending on this. You know, and it's not just in terms of building up the companies, the state-owned enterprises that will get involved in this ultimately. It's the research institutes that are there. And there's a huge amount of human capital that is being thrown at these issues. And you know, if we do a comparison, for example, with what the United States has available within government agencies, you know, we're really looking at a handful of people whose job it is to look at these questions. And the Chinese have got entire research institutes staffed with hundreds of people that are looking at how you do this better. So the lead that we have on the technological side of things, you know, may be not illusory, but it may not last very long. And so I think the urgency of it is actually, you know, should be quite apparent that we need to take steps pretty quickly. And, you know, I guess the other side of that is to say that we're seeing a proliferation right now of the technologies that are available for extraction. And that's because there's pretty heavy competition. I mean, you know, the metals company is just one of the companies that is operating in this space. There is rapid innovation, as you would hope to see, you know, the United States economy, but more generally globally or in the West. And, you know, it's clear from that there's so much at stake here, and the profits are potentially enormous, that you're seeing a race, a technological race to actually move ahead. And what heartens me is that, and I know we'll come to this question later on, but that technological race isn't just about scale or efficiency. That a lot of that innovation is taking place in terms of environmental sensitivity, you know, and making sure that we have not only technologies that don't disrupt the environment, or, you know, that we limit the environmental disruption of these technologies, but also that we are ensuring that we're gathering the data that we need to make those decisions properly.
Absolutely. I think we make some compelling arguments to understand why China should not be driving this mining space, but Seaver, since we have you here, maybe we should at least inform everyone in the room, comparing or contrasting China's land-based, you know, mining activities and the impact on the environment versus what we've just been discussing from Kristin in terms of the technological breakthroughs. So it's sort of set that in a context of, you know, China's, you know, currently sort of driving this initiative, but they should not be. And perhaps Seaver, comment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we consider these critical minerals because these supply chains are highly concentrated in a few countries, particularly China. And so how did that overconcentration occur in the first place? Well, you know, if I'm being extremely frank, That is because in the 90s and early aughts, as China's economy was growing and as China was becoming integrated within global trade, Chinese industries really sort of entered these heavy industrial markets in a very sort of low cost, low environmental standards, high carbon intensity fashion. And ultimately ended up outcompeting a lot of international competitors in these critical mineral sectors, and concentrating the market. And as they achieve that concentration of the market, they basically have near monopolies or monopolies on the expertise and the technological know-how for how to mine these minerals, do the ore processing, and do the refining and smelting of these critical minerals from the traditional sort of terrestrial supply chain. And with that overconcentration, they're further able to influence those commodity markets by sending waves through the market when there are new international entrants trying to compete in those spaces. So, for example, by supercharging production and crashing the price of those critical minerals to force new international entrants sort of out of those markets. There's sort of a heavy monopolistic or monopsonistic dynamics going on there. And these new entrants are competing against, coal-fired energy, highly unsafe sort of industrial facilities that you wouldn't be allowed to build in the West, and, exploited labor, so on and so forth. And so the exciting thing about nodule collection is that it not only is cost competitive on price with these traditional land-based terrestrial supply chains, but also offers sort of inherent advantages, particularly in carbon emissions, but also on the environmental impact side, while also, as my co-panelists have mentioned, playing to sort of Western technological advantages in terms of robotics, AI, and ocean science. And so that's really sort of an exciting potential way to sort of disrupt these critical mineral commodity chains, while also actually advancing sort of good social and environmental outcomes potentially if done well.
Very good. There's a lot of talk. Thank you, Seaver, about the potential impact on the environment. There's also the social and all the governance impacts associated with commercial deep sea mining. But we have to again put this in the context and give it deeper meaning. I'm curious, Kristin, in terms of the metals company, maybe you could provide us with a kind of another different kind of overview of the international kind of code components and the tenure and the status, the negotiation process, and even addressing this two-year trigger point.
Yeah, most definitely. So I think, key to say we've been in this exploration phase for quite a long time. So for the metals company specifically, we've been offshore doing the deep ocean research for about 13 years. So we have our first contract with Nauru in 2011. And so essentially in that time, right, there is a temporal and I guess content requirement around the environmental baseline work that you do. So essentially 3 years of environmental baseline work, resource definition work, and then this full-on environmental and social impact assessment that goes into an exploitation application. And so for us specifically, we've worked with leading deep ocean science consortiums to accomplish this feat. There will be about 200 million that we've spent on that ESIA at the time of our application. And in contrast with maybe an environmental impact assessment on land, it's really hard to get at those numbers because essentially it's rolled into your entire mine development plan. But Queensland, Australia is one that gives a projection for maybe a mid-sized mining operation to be between maybe $70,000 and $300,000. So you can see just the overall context and kind of depth of work that is being done because it's a completely nascent industry. But so essentially there's been more broadly from TMC about 300 campaigns to the CCZ since the 1960s. There's been over $2 billion spent on research by contractors alone. So that's not even including what governments have spent on it. And so there is just a actual insane amount of data available. And so that's one hosted by the ISA, so all of that data is public through their deep database, and then also by the UNESCO Ocean Biodiversity Information System. And so NORI, which is our Nauruan entity, has submitted the largest set of data, and that's even before like the final tranches from our post-collector test. And so there is just a whole plethora of data available, contrary to the public sentiment. And so that goes into, right, it's fed back into, right, we present this at ISA meetings, but also it's the science community that publishes that work. So they're free to publish what they find. And some of those key kind of environmental threshold works are being really coordinated by, you know, CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, working with the science arm of New Zealand, for example, on environmental management and monitoring plans. And so there's a lot of detail that goes into it, right? Even our pilot collection tests, environmental impact statement had public stakeholder comment period was about, well, many pages, to which the US did submit comments. So people are reading it, they're actively tracking. Right, and this is something that is a feedback loop to actually defining what is set in stone in the regulations, and then will be updated once mining occurs. So that's just kind of a high level overview of what goes into the environmental impact assessment. The social part is separate, and so the social impact assessment we're doing with a company called Prisma in Wisconsin. And essentially, right, there are no human communities near the resource, but that doesn't mean there aren't cultural ties to the ocean, this area, and so there's both a social and cultural heritage impact assessment going on. As Seaver mentioned, you avoid entirely a lot of the land-based mining impacts on humans, whether that be indigenous communities, but also health risks that are posed by local mining operations in some jurisdictions.
Very good.
James, I think what's really important about what Kristin's saying is that one of the most common things you hear in this space is that, you know, we know more about the surface of the moon or Mars or whatever, you know, extraplanetary body we want to choose than we do about the deep sea. And it's simply not true. I mean, there is so much data, and there are samples that have been gathered. You know, we're excited today because the Chinese have come back from the dark side of the moon with minerals that, you know, we haven't seen before. That's fantastic. But, you know, we know exactly how to do that in the ocean, and we've been doing it, and we're gathering data. And, you know, as one of the things that I've learned over the past couple of years is that, you know, we do actually need to take up our responsibility to look at the data. Because if the data is out there and it's freely available, and if science is what it's supposed to be, then we should be actually testing hypotheses about this. The second side of it is, you know, what Kristin began to get into at the end there, which is that, you know, we know so much about the harmful impacts of terrestrial mining, you know, particularly in very sensitive ecosystems, such as you would find in Indonesia, for example.
Yes.
And we barely say anything about it. You know, I mean, there's lots of people who protest against the mining industry. But the fact is that, you know, we feel as though, well, that's just going to happen, isn't it? And you've got an industry here that's going into the deep sea that, whether it was because they're honorable and noble or because they knew that they would be held accountable for it, which I think is the most likely explanation, that is actually taking as many precautions as they possibly can and generating as much data, which is publicly available. And that's a really, really good thing.
On the other hand, you have to say a lot of the non-government organizations, the NGOs, are letting all of this data sort of wash over them, or they're not responding to it, given the empirical data that has been published in, you know, very prestigious journals that really examines the new technologies and the impact, or the lack of significant impact on the sediment blooms and other issues. So, you know, there's a gap there, something that is not being responded to by NGOs in terms of that the data deluge, if you wish. Caitlin, did you have any other comments about any updated reviews of technologies that might be coming across your desk and deep ocean data sets, and how that might fit into your next report or briefing for Congress?
Well, I think, you know, kind of what Kristin and Duncan touched on, I don't need to like go back into too much. I think, like I mentioned earlier, there's one piece of legislation that has called on NOAA and the National Academies to provide a comprehensive study. And so if that bill were passed, then it would be up to NOAA and the National Academies to interpret what that means. And if they want to look at the extensive scientific literature that's out there to inform their assessment. But and again, to their points, technology has also evolved since there. And that technology includes technology to actually mine the seafloor, but also technology to make scientific observations of the seafloor as well as to what's down there. So technology is evolving all around. And so when we look or when we think about some of the previous work that NOAA or BOEM or the USGS has done in terms of understanding the potential environmental impacts associated with seabed mining activities, some of the studies go back to the 70s and 80s. And, my understanding of the technology back then was more like pulling a plow through the seabed, which is going to cause a lot of disturbance. And so that was happening. In particular, there's one site off of Georgia on the Lake Plateau where they dragged a plow across to collect nodules there off-site Georgia. And they were doing it there because it was just closer to the US than doing it in the open Pacific Ocean. But USGS went back and they put down these patio blocks in the 80s. And in recent years, NOAA, USGS, and BOEM have been going back to study the recovery there. And what they found is that there was damage done to that environment. But again, those were practices used
Old
in the
technology.
70s, right? So I think it's just mindful to keep in as the technology is evolving, that also we need to be assessing the current scientific data that looks at that.
Thank you. We have this, increasing number of people here in the room, but I'm ready to open this up to questions from the audience directed to any of the panelists here this afternoon. Let's start. Please introduce yourself and your identification.
Hi, thank you so much. This is fascinating. My name is Maddie. I work for Van Holland's office. And obviously there's a lot of research to be done. And that exists, and to survey and to act on and to regulate in so many ways. Well, I made that statement, but I do think what you were saying about innovation mixed with like national security, and that the US and Western countries kind of have the cutting edge and a lot of that I find really fascinating. So I'm curious, to what extent do you toe the line between like this publicly available information for the betterment of society versus, this is potentially a leveraging for like a bargaining chip that the United States should be using? And is there some sort of protection that should be applied to some parts of that research or information? Like I don't know, do you think about the international competition? Is there a part where like Department of Defense has a stake in this topic and that there should be a role that they're playing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there's within the ISA, there's reporting requirements and all of the data that is public on the offshore research side. And then there's very much, right, as a private entity, like our technology developed with Allseas and like the robotic collector and really the IP, even associated with the digital twin that we're developing to actually real-time monitor the operations and share that, not just with the regulator, but with the public, which really doesn't exist for land-based mining today. And so there are pieces of that obviously are IP within certain contractor boundaries. And there's definitely, a space where, right, this is in a very interesting location geopolitically, right, in the Indo-Pacific. It's an area where the US is really trying to grow its Pacific Island relationships, and an area where China has a lot of growing influence, right? And so I think there are definitely connections to, right, US defense, Navy, for example, which would be much better positioned to maybe protect this type of resource versus maybe a deposit in Africa, for example. So there are definitely areas where they could get more involved. And I think that's probably the genesis of this National Defense Authorization Act report that should talk a little bit about that in an unclassed report anyway.
I think it's very important to take some time to look at what the folks over at DARPA are doing. Look at subsea platforms, look at the sort of the multiple uses of these technologies. And, you begin by saying, okay, so we need this stuff because of national security. The flip side of that is that the Chinese are developing all of this. And so while they're down there ostensibly harvesting polymetallic nodules, do we know what else they're doing down there? And that's something that I think we do need to be concerned about. I'm not wishing to feed into the hysteria in Washington about China.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that from a simple national security perspective, we should be concerned about it, and we should be making every effort to be the leaders in that technology.
Yes, please. And you are?
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. But despite all that, most of my graduate work was in ferromanganese. The early mining technologies were largely vacuum cleaners, developed best by Japan. And that produced this huge plume of mud that covers perhaps rare species that the NGOs felt upset about. More recent approaches look at much more expensive robotics, which would use artificial intelligence to actually grab individual rocks and throw them in either into a suction system or into a hopper that gets floated to the surface at some point. Having said that, if the Chinese decide to conduct some sort of ferromanganese operation in the Solomons using older technologies, there's not a lot we can do legally. And if the plume leaves Solomon Island space and goes into one of the adjacent properties, you have a mess which you really can do nothing about. I'm wondering if the permitting and licensing phases can sort of define the minimum environmental approaches to this on the entire cycle. I was privy to the experiments in which we formed concretes and road macadam from the ganj, the leftover rock, once the valuable minerals were extracted. And some of that was good and some of it wasn't. But if the permitting and licensing process demands a completely integrated environmental picture from the technology you use to how you get it to the surface, to what you ultimately do with the ganj, or there's no permit or no license coming your way, that would seem to be the most intelligent approach to this problem. But I don't see any of that.
Yeah, and then maybe I can, we kind of blended a couple topics there, but right, so the ISA's jurisdiction would end after the collection phase, right? So like that processing piece is dependent on who does the processing. So in our case, the combined kind of pyro-hydrometallurgical processing, we do make some road aggregates, but by and large, near zero solid waste. So we make nickel, cobalt, sulfates, copper cathode, and a manganese silicate, which is really an alternative to conventional manganese ore. So that's really an input for steel versus battery markets. On the context of like the permitting, right? So with the international regime, there will be those environmental thresholds set. There will be, right, a pollution fund essentially. So if there is polluting and it goes beyond that threshold, what does that look like? I will say for monitoring and kind of enforcing around China's activity, right? We were talking about this before the session, is that who holds them accountable in other contexts that aren't deep sea mining? For example, illegal fishing, some of the COVID implications. So it's a broader question around the global community holding bad actors accountable that goes beyond, I would say, deep sea mining. And then I would also mention that within the international framework, right, to date, China has not operated outside of their, outside of the treaty, for example. So they have not gone ahead and tested in international waters without approval, right? They follow the environmental baselining requirements for their areas. They have quite a robust data set across their areas. And so it's kind of this unique space where they don't have necessarily the same ability to drive their own agenda as they do in land-based markets, right, where there is more corruption, more political instability, the ability to be out of sight, out of mind on some of these very real ecosystem and human impacts that, I think to Duncan's point, we do tend to turn a blind eye to because we don't really have an alternative.
Look at
So-
the environmental devastation of their mining.
Yeah.
You think it's gonna be any better at sea?
Well, see, that's the thing, right? So you have the entire world looking at those regulations. So as much as we say like China is there driving their agenda, they have the most licenses, they contribute the most, they're very active in negotiations. But you also have all of Europe, the European Union, the US to a certain extent as an observer without a voting right. But Canada, Mexico, you have almost every country in the world setting those regulations alongside China. And there's really no other context where that is the case.
Can I give a good news, bad news response? I'll begin with the bad news. Right now in the critical mineral supply chain, we really don't do our due diligence. If it's artisanal mining and, there is child labor involved, it goes into the same processing and refining as everything else and comes through and we just accept it. Okay, so we don't do our work at this point in time. But the good news is this, is that we're moving away from that at a hearteningly fast rate. And that's because companies out there are investing heavily in AI applications for the supply chain and understanding at sort of up to 4 levels of the supply chain what the environmental and social implications are. And so, if we begin to put our faith in Western companies to go and extract seabed minerals because we believe that their norms and values are better than the Chinese, and if we build out the capacity for processing and refining in friendly countries where we can monitor it better, then we actually do have the potential to keep the supply chains separate, one from the other. What the Chinese are doing need not necessarily impact or infect what we are doing. Okay. Now back to the bad news, which is that the evidence that we have so far for the companies that are out there who provide this kind of deep level analysis, investigation into supply chains, is that they're pretty good at it. But when they share that information with the end user of that product, and let's say you are a company that, let's say you're a company that makes automobiles, right? And you discover that one of your 3rd or 4th tier suppliers is using child labor in one of their factories, you're faced with a real problem as the end user, which is that you don't have a relationship with that 3rd or 4th tier supplier. So you have to go to your supplier who goes to their supplier who goes to them. But worse than that, now you know that there's child labor in your supply chain. What do you do about it? Do you actually sort of admit to it? Do you fess up and have the public relations nightmare, or do you try to ignore it and hopefully it goes away? And that's a very real situation, not with an automobile company, but those are the kind of choices that are being faced, every day now. Because the more we know, the more the responsibility falls upon us as the end user to try to fix it. So we really do have to get into the governance of this issue, which is, as Kristin says, it's not just about the international governance, it's about the end user governance. So when we're actually getting the product that we need. And there's been some heartening progress in that. Look at the European approach to the battery passport. The idea that you actually do need to have verification of where did the metals come from that end up in the EV battery before it goes to market.
Good. Thank you, Duncan, for that response. Anyone else have some questions? Look, we have these experts here, please. And you are?
Hi, I'm Mark Schulze from Senator Finance Office, proud co-sponsor of the Senate Resolution 4466. I'm going to try to just synthesize by way of question, synthesize all of the points you said. So correct me if I got this wrong. All right, so critical minerals are an indispensable part of our future, and terrestrial resources are currently oversubscribed. Our primary competitor is national security threat, holds enormous leverage over us, and they promise to exploit that up in the world at order in their favor. Their advantage is massive on land, especially, and terrestrial resources are dwarfed by oceanic ones and are in complex operating environments. That's the euphemism for Congo, Papua New Guinea, etc. There's also scores more light in these terrestrial environments, thousands per square meter versus tens, and versus on the seafloor. And these deep sea bed zones are not in our undisputed ECs and not even necessarily in our disputed ECFs. And to that point, our other major rival, Russia, has made explicit on numerous occasions now that they don't recognize our extended continental shelf. That's we're not members of the plus. So comparatively earth-saving, competition-winning, already reserved for us, requiring nothing more than the signature of 67 people, resources are waiting for us if we just simply ratify UN diplomacy. So we wouldn't ratify it because of a play devil's advocate, I already know the answers to the sovereignty concerns, the dues we have to pay the ISA, technical feasibility, or because what we're hearing lately, there are already existing laws in place that allow us to access those resources. So particularly on that last point, thoughts, are we able to just go over to the CCZ right now and let's say Lockheed had all the technology, or they sold it to TFC or some other way, and they just grab the polymetallic nodules right now, keep those in the American supply chain legally?
Legally, no.
Sorry, what was that for the record?
I would say legally, no, and I would just maybe note that NOAA does recognize they don't have jurisdiction in international waters, right? And so as you say, outside of extended continental shelf in particular, right, under DSHMRA, it was, right, by and large, an interim law that they still recognize because there's been no update. But I think legally, the answer to that would be. Now, I would defer to the actual legal expert on that.
I am not the legal expert at CRS. But I think, US access beyond our EEZ and extended continental shelf is uncertain and open to debate based on who you'd ask that question to. Thinking about the existing, NOAA issued, exploration licenses in the CZ, I think that indicates that there really isn't international recognition for US activities beyond our national jurisdiction. And the most obvious example of that being that, of those plots that Lockheed Martin holds NOAA licenses for, the ISA came and designated an area that as an area of protected, area of particular environmental interest, an API, and that's overlapping part of that area. And what that means is it's a no mining zone. And so that suggests that US activities are not being recognized. And those two licenses that Lockheed Martin holds from NOAA will expire in 2027. And it'll just be interesting to see if Lockheed Martin requests an extension of that. Because I think if you ask NOAA has been just doing what DSHMRA says. And if an extension is requested, if it meets all the criteria, they're going to approve it. And so those are how they've remained active since 1984 when they're initially issued. But come 2027, I think it'll be interesting to see if Lockheed Martin requests an additional 5-year extension. And the reason that is potentially interesting is, and this is something Kristin could probably speak to, is Lockheed Martin established a subsidiary in the UK, and through sponsorship of the UK had 2 ISA contracts for the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. But in March 2023, Lockheed Martin sold that company to Loki Minerals, which is a Norwegian company. So it's unclear if maybe Lockheed Martin is stepping away from the game and won't request an extension of those 2 licenses that the US or NOAA has in the CCZ.
I think connected to that is the reason why you can make an argument that this isn't a crisis yet, is because if you look at the list of exploration contracts through the ISA, you take out China and Russia, and you're left with South Korea, Japan, Germany, India, UK, France, Poland, Nauru, Tonga, Belgium, Kiribati, Singapore, Cook Islands, Jamaica. Pretty friendly countries. Those minerals will enter the global supply chain. And so maybe the United States has the opportunity to benefit from that anyway, without getting, directly involved. But the key will come down to, can you actually put in place the processing and refining facilities in friendly countries so that you can direct those minerals to the places and thereby control the supply chain from the top down?
Seaver, do you want to
I'll offer to take any questions on environmental impacts. And I'm actually curious, just by a show of hands, how many people watched the John Oliver Last Week Tonight segment on deep sea minerals? Okay, yeah. I took extensive notes. But
Any environmental questions, Seaver?
Might just offer, I mean, there's a public webinar on this that our offshore environmental team put together, but it's kind of 6 big picture items that we think about for environmental impacts. And I know you mentioned the plumes, for example. So, right, and kind of the plows are the first generation of this, but essentially today's vacuum cleaner type robotic collectors interact with the top couple of centimeters of sediment. And so studies by MIT as well as the Danish Hydrology Institute have actually modeled, but then also with in-field data, right, tracked where these plumes go. So there's a seafloor plume, and then there's a re-injection or mid-water column plume. And so what they found is that actually that plume only rises about 2 meters above the seafloor. And it really behaves more like a liquid than a gas at those depths and pressures, really follows the contour of the seafloor. And I think that was something not necessarily anticipated, but extremely different than kind of the widespread speculation that we're going to dwarf ocean life throughout the water column. Similarly, that plume stays within the operating zone. So if you look at actually tracking that turbidity or dissolved solids, it really is dissipating to swimming pool or drinking water levels within that operating zone. And so there is not that risk of, right, plumes reaching the coast of Hawaii, which has been speculated really with no scientific basis. That mid-water column plume similarly dilutes very quickly from essentially the ship is moving, right? We're collecting as we go. And so that dissipates very quickly as well. And so that's at about 2,000 meter depths, where there's virtually no ability to impact fisheries, which are the top level of the ocean. And so the plume, I think, has been largely debunked, even though it's kind of like the basis of some of the activist opposition. And that kind of trend continues when you look at things like carbon sinks disruption. So the ocean is the largest carbon sink in the world, but it's the water itself that holds that, not the sediment.
Can I take that one?
Yeah. I know you love.
So yeah, I mean, you know, as I sort of got interested in this sort of seafloor and offshore debate and looking at it sort of with an ocean science background, it really kind of surprised me when I saw that actually a lot of the I saw there seemed to be a lot of sort of scientific exaggeration and misrepresentation. And it was actually mostly coming from the opponents of seafloor and nodule collection. So for example, one of the claims that came up in the John Oliver segment was that deep sea mining might disrupt the ocean carbon cycle and sort of impact the ocean's ability to store CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's really the surface ocean that's responsible through physical, biological, and chemical processes for absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. And then there are very important processes that shunt that carbon from the surface ocean to the deep ocean. And once it's in the deep ocean, everyone learns this in your first year of graduate school oceanography, it stays there for thousands of years because ocean carbon cycling in the deep ocean is very slow. And so the claim made that seafloor life on the seafloor, like bacteria, are very important for deep ocean carbon cycling is not actually consistent with our understanding of ocean biogeochemistry. That's the ocean seafloor life's role in deep ocean carbon cycling is so negligible it's not included in most figures in most textbooks. And even insofar as it is important for deep ocean carbon cycling, it's important because the deep ocean seafloor is massive. And so the perception that the Clarion-Clipperton zone, this nodule field, is somehow the focal point or the keystone for the ocean carbon cycle is not consistent with our understanding of ocean carbon cycling. If that were true, it'd actually be a very revolutionary finding in sort of ocean carbon biogeochemistry. And it's not sort of what's borne out in the evidence. And so, you know, I think seeing things like that in the ocean seafloor discourse really signals to me that, you know, that activists, you know, with good intentions are really trying to, by any means necessary, ensure that we basically never source seafloor metals under any circumstances. It's very similar to, for example, opposition to nuclear energy, or even opposition to terrestrial mining, you know, the idea that we can somehow source all of these metals from the energy transition just through, for example, recycling or reduction. And so I think it comes from a very naive standpoint, and ultimately I would argue even does a disservice to attempt to sort of enforce accountability on this industry, because you end up looking like a 5G conspiracy theorist, because you're really sort of misrepresenting a lot of the ocean science.
Chemtrails, man, chemtrails.
Yeah,
So actually, coming out that point here, I await Rob Goldman, congressional fellow with Senator Bruno's office. Senator Bruno being the lead sponsor of Senate Resolution 466. I know a number of people here are staff among the co-sponsors for that resolution. How do we better communicate with the public about what's actually known about the potential environmental impacts of deep sea mining? And how do we address, I guess, other devil's advocate claims, like, for example, I was reading an article about, there's a study that recently came out this month about battery recycling as having like several orders of magnitude more critical mineral extraction potential, or being able to address the amount of raw material compared with deep sea mining. So how would you address those?
Maybe
It looks like there's gonna be a part 2 to this discussion. Because I just looked at I'm trying to be a good time manager. I'm glad that science gets the last word here. Seaver, thank you for that. I also want to really recognize and thank our panelists who showed up and shared their expertise with us this afternoon. We benefit from that. I benefit from that. What have we learned today real quickly? U.S. can play a significant role in establishing and promoting sustainable mining practices. And we should contribute to these international discussions. We will have more discussions here and elsewhere in Washington, but the U.S. can help write the rules and set the best possible deep sea mining practices. We have that obligation. We have that responsibility. And I hope we can move this conversation along. And we'll see you again in part 2. And I appreciate you showing up for our program this afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
You were just getting rolling.
Yeah, I just think we're here.